Dr. Theseira.
Hi, thank you, Jasmine, and thanks everybody for being here and spending your afternoon here with us. I'm going to start sharing some of my slides. Okay, so what's this all about? Yeah, so let me start by giving you a couple of headlines from the news, and let me know if at any point you've got any questions or you can't hear me or things like that. You can put it in the chat and I'll probably see it, or somebody will let me know that it's there. Okay, so here are a selection of headlines from the news over the last year. Okay, and if you have been paying attention to the news during COVID, these kinds of headlines will be quite familiar to you, right? So what are examples of headlines? Studies so far agree most COVID-19 vaccines are effective against the Delta variant. Sounds good, right? Oh, and then 1 month after that, but British study shows COVID-19 vaccine efficacy wanes under Delta, just 1 month after, okay? In South Africa, Omicron wave, Pfizer vaccine less effective against hospitalization. 2 days after that, new studies raise hopes that vaccines prevent severe disease from Omicron. So I think during the COVID-19 pandemic, we were very used to getting conflicting information on almost a daily basis. And I want to stress here that all of these headlines I'm showing here do not come from fake news or dubious sources of information. In fact, all of them come from searching the Straits Times. They may not be articles authored by Straits Times journalists, but they're basically all articles from credible mainstream sources, you know, like Reuters, New York Times, and so on. Some of them syndicated and put out in the Straits Times. So this is not, a talk about fake news. This is a talk about information, about science, news, and findings, which, according to the scientific community, are reasonably reliable, and yet they're highly contradictory. So what should we do, right? And more broadly speaking, I think the question I'm trying to get a handle on here is, how do we think about scientific findings when we're formulating policy, right? I mean, on the one extreme, of course, there are going to be some people out there who hold on to conspiracy theories, right? So for them, there's no scientific finding good enough. Basically, it's unclear actually how they make policy or how they make decisions, but they don't pay much attention to science. And on the other hand, at least not science as we see it, right? And on the other hand, there's also the extremely skeptical view that you could take, right? Which is that every single thing needs to be tested. And, that's kind of the view I lean towards. But we're going to see that even taking the view that you need to rigorously test findings and hypotheses actually isn't quite enough. Again, we'll talk a bit about why that is the case. So, more generally, I think we have what I call a policy evidence interpretation problem. So what is this problem all about? Well, if you look at this flowchart, right, what we're really trying to do is we are trying to figure out some relationship between cause and effect, right? So what's a cause? Well, a cause could be a policy intervention. So a policy intervention would be things like whether we want people to get vaccinated, whether we want people to wear masks in public, or, whether we want to introduce a new program to address a social issue like unemployment. So these are all causes, right? And an effect, well, an effect is a policy outcome. It's what we want to achieve, okay? So why do I say cause and effect? Because if we're rational, if we're making, decisions on an evidence-based basis, we would like some assurance that whatever we're doing at the cause end actually connects to the effect end. And that's where your theory of behavior, your theory of cause and effect actually comes in, right? What explains why the cause leads to the effect. And the challenge here is it's going to be very rare that you have a situation where you just have one very simple theory of behavior, okay? And what I want to stress here is this problem applies, okay, even when we're talking about things that seem to us as if they're hard science issues, okay? I mean, so what are hard science issues? A lot of people think that the COVID pandemic is all about hard science, right? So what they want to know is they want to know answers to questions like, is wearing masks effective or not? If it is, then surely we should force everybody to wear them, right? Is vaccination work? If it does work, we should force everybody to get vaccinated, right? So to some people, problems are apparently about hard science. Either in the lab it works or it doesn't work. But the reality is, a lot of the decisions we face, and even in COVID regarding medical decisions, they're actually a blend of different theories of behavior that actually matter in the field, okay? And so masks are actually a very good example of this. I might be able to assess using a hard science approach, whether in a lab test, masks actually make a difference or not. Okay, and I might be able to describe using lab test parameters, how many % of particles they filter and things of that type, okay? The problem is, once I put that policy into the field, I'm no longer dealing with people who are wearing masks as if they were in the lab, okay? And once you're in the field and dealing with real people who can wear masks in all sorts of different ways and maybe not wear the mask consistently, or maybe, as some arguments go, they get lulled to a false sense of security because they're wearing masks, then you involve many other theories of behavior that in the end make your effects not as strong as they might be otherwise, okay? And those are the issues that you need to contend with. Okay, but in general, what we're going to be trying to do is trying to figure out how do we link cause and effect, you know, based on the theory of behavior, and how does the evidence we look at actually inform these theories, right? So why is it then so hard to develop an evidence-based public policy? So, you know, scientific evidence is based on proving a cause and effect relationship. And this picture here shows you some of the basic kinds of science experiments that all of us used to do when we were school children, right? We would do a randomized control trial. We would do a carefully controlled experiment. So, you know, in our primary school science classes, if we wanted to learn, for example, about, I don't know, maybe the effects of fertilizer on growing plants or the effects of sunlight, you would set up these little pots of plants. You would have some of the pots have the experiment. So maybe some pots have got fertilizer, some don't. And you would try to make sure the conditions are the same. And, you know, if there was a difference in the growth rate of the plants, you would conclude from that, oh, guess what? Fertilizer maybe makes plants grow faster. Okay, so that's a carefully controlled experiment. And the usefulness of these experiments is that they give us a counterfactual. So what is a counterfactual? It's a benchmark. It's a description of the way the world would be if you never implemented the policy intervention. And the reason why the counterfactual is so important is that you actually need to understand which part of your outcomes are due to chance, which part of your outcomes are actually due to what you're trying to do, right? Due to your cause and effect story, due to your theory of behavior. And that's why we run clinical trials of medicines, right? Because we honestly don't understand that much about the human body. There are a number of illnesses that actually most illnesses resolve themselves by themselves, right? And because most illnesses resolve by themselves, if you were to treat everybody with a new experimental medicine, you would never be able to figure out how effective the medicine is. So you need to deliberately give some people the medication and withhold the medication from some other people while letting them think that they might be medicated to see whether there's an actual difference that the medication causes, right? So that's the principle behind randomized controlled trials. So that's the scientific method. How does this relate to economic problems? Well, the problem is once you get down to most economically relevant problems, and that includes actually the problem of what to do about COVID-19, you realize that all of us, okay, people, firms, governments, we actually do lots of different kinds of things at the same time. We change many kinds of behaviors at once, right? So if I'm trying to figure out whether wearing masks works or not in a particular society, I'm never going to have a situation in real life where the only difference after a mask mandate is people wear masks and they don't change anything else about what they're doing in their lives, okay? In reality, if I put in a mask mandate, I'm probably, as a government, going to combine that mask mandate with other policies that also change people's behavior. I might introduce a mask mandate and I also introduce warnings about social distancing at the same time, or I advise people to stay indoors, and that changes behavior. So you got 2 or 3 things going on at once, okay? Even if I, as a government, don't tell people to change behavior, I just say, look, wear a mask, but you can do everything else as normal. I can't stop people from inferring from my announcement about masks that suddenly the world is very dangerous, people could get infected, and therefore they voluntarily stay at home. And I also can't stop firms from choosing, for example, to go and work from home or closing shop or whatever, because they also fear what might happen in the market as a result of my announcement about wearing masks. So the point is, isolated one cause and effect at a time is actually incredibly difficult. And that's the thing we struggle with, right? When I change policies, as I mentioned earlier, people change their behavior, okay? So that's actually one of the big challenges we face. I'm going to go through a bit of a case study so we can see more about this in a while as well, okay? But before I go there, I'm now going to show you a video which also describes another problem we're going to be dealing with. as well. Okay. Actually, wait. Let me share the video instead directly, because I think according to Zoom, this is a bit better. Let me check. Okay. So hold on. Give me a second. Yeah. Okay. Let me see whether this works. Okay. All right. So I'm going to start sharing a video on more things that we should know about the evidence problem.
In 2011, an article was published in the reputable Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. It was called Feeling the Future: Experimental Evidence for Anomalous Retroactive Influences on Cognition and Affect. Or in other words, proof that people can see into the future. The paper reported on 9 experiments. In one, participants were shown 2 curtains on a computer screen and asked to predict which one had an image behind it. The other just covered a blank wall. Once the participant made their selection, the computer randomly positioned an image behind one of the curtains. Then the selected curtain was pulled back to show either the image or the blank wall. The images were randomly selected from one of 3 categories: neutral, negative, or erotic. If participants selected the curtain covering the image, this was considered a hit. Now, with there being 2 curtains and the images positioned randomly behind one of them, you would expect the hit rate to be about 50%. And that is exactly what the researchers found, at least for negative and neutral images. However, for erotic images, the hit rate was 53%. Does that mean that we can see into the future? Is that slight deviation significant? Well, to assess significance, scientists usually turn to p-values, a statistic that tells you how likely a result, at least this extreme, is if the null hypothesis is true. In this case, the null hypothesis would just be that people couldn't actually see into the future, and the 53% result was due to lucky guesses. For this study, the p-value was 0.01, meaning there was just a 1% chance of getting a hit rate of 53% or higher from simple luck. P-values less than 0.05 are generally considered significant and worthy of publication. But you might want to use a higher bar before you accept that humans can accurately perceive the future and, say, invite the study's author on your news program. But hey, it's your choice. After all, the 0.05 threshold was arbitrarily selected by Ronald Fisher in a book he published in 1925. But this raises the question, how much of the published research literature is actually false? The intuitive answer seems to be 5%. I mean, if everyone's using p less than 0.05 as a cutoff for statistical significance, you would expect 5 of every 100 results to be false positives. But that, unfortunately, grossly underestimates the problem. And here's why. Imagine you're a researcher in a field where there are 1,000 hypotheses currently being investigated. Let's assume that 10% of them reflect true relationships and the rest are false. But no one, of course, knows which are which. That's the whole point of doing the research. Now, assuming the experiments are pretty well designed, they should correctly identify around, say, 80 of the 100 true relationships. This is known as a statistical power of 80%. So 20 results are false negatives. Perhaps the sample size was too small or the measurements were not sensitive enough. Now consider that from those 900 false hypotheses, using a p-value of 0.05, 45 false hypotheses will be incorrectly considered true. As for the rest, they will be correctly identified as false, but most journals rarely publish null results. They make up just 10 to 30% of papers, depending on the field. Which means that the papers that eventually get published will include 80 true positive results, 45 false positive results, and maybe 20 true negative results. Nearly a third of published results will be wrong, even with the system working normally. Things get even worse if studies are underpowered, and analysis shows they typically are, if there is a higher ratio of false to true hypotheses being tested, or if the researchers are biased. All of this was pointed out in a 2005 paper entitled "Why Most Published Research is False." So recently, researchers in a number of fields have attempted to quantify the problem by replicating some prominent past results. The Reproducibility project repeated 100 psychology studies, but found only 36% had a statistically significant result the second time around. And the strength of measured relationships were on average half those of the original studies. An attempted verification of 53 studies considered landmarks in the basic science of cancer only managed to reproduce 6. Even working closely with the original study's authors. These results are even worse than I just calculated. The reason for this is nicely illustrated by a 2015 study showing that eating a bar of chocolate every day can help you lose weight faster. In this case, the participants were randomly allocated to one of 3 treatment groups. One went on a low-carb diet, another went on the same low-carb diet plus a 1.5-ounce bar of chocolate per day, and the third group was the control, instructed just to maintain their regular eating habits. At the end of 3 weeks, the control group had neither lost nor gained weight, but both low-carb groups had lost an average of 5 pounds per person. The group that ate chocolate, however, lost weight 10% faster than the non-chocolate eaters. The finding was statistically significant with a p-value less than 0.05. As you might expect, this news spread like wildfire to the front page of Bild, the most widely circulated daily newspaper in Europe, then to the Daily Star, the Irish Examiner, the Huffington Post, and even Shape magazine. Unfortunately, the whole thing had been faked. Kind of. I mean, researchers did perform the experiment exactly as they described, but they intentionally designed it to increase the likelihood of false positives. The sample size was incredibly small, just 5 people per treatment group, and for each person, 18 different measurements were tracked, including weight, cholesterol, sodium, blood protein levels, sleep quality, well-being, and so on. So if weight loss didn't show a significant difference, there were plenty of other factors that might have. So the headline could have been chocolate lowers cholesterol, or increases sleep quality, or something. The point is, a p-value is only really valid for a single measure. Once you're comparing a whole slew of variables, the probability that at least one of them gives you a false positive goes way up. And this is known as p-hacking. Researchers can make a lot of decisions about their analysis that can decrease the p-value. For example, let's say you analyze your data and you find it nearly reaches statistical significance, so you decide to collect just a few more data points to be sure. Then, if the p-value drops below 0.05, you stop collecting data, confident that these additional data points could only have made the result more significant if there were really a true relationship there. But numerical simulations show that relationships can cross the significance threshold by adding more data points, even though a much larger sample would show that there really is no relationship. In fact, there are a great number of ways to increase the likelihood of significant results, like having 2 dependent variables, adding more observations, controlling for gender, or dropping one of 3 conditions. Combining all 3 of these strategies together increases the likelihood of a false positive to over 60%, and that is using p less than 0.05. Now, if you think this is just a problem for psychology, neuroscience, or medicine, consider the pentaquark, an exotic particle made up of 5 quarks, as opposed to the regular 3 for protons or neutrons. Particle physics employs particularly stringent requirements for statistical significance, referred to as 5 sigma, or 1 chance in 3.5 million of getting a false positive. But in 2002, a Japanese experiment found evidence for the theta plus pentaquark. And in the 2 years that followed, 11 other independent experiments then looked for and found evidence of that same pentaquark with very high levels of statistical significance. From July 2003 to May 2004, a theoretical paper on pentaquarks was published on average every other day. But alas, it was a false discovery. Further experimental attempts to confirm the theta plus pentaquark using greater statistical power failed to find any trace of its existence. The problem was those first scientists weren't blind to the data. They knew how the numbers were generated and what answer they expected to get. And the way the data was cut and analyzed, or p-hacked, produced the false finding. Now, most scientists aren't p-hacking maliciously. There are legitimate decisions to be made about how to collect, analyze, and report data, and these decisions impact on the statistical significance of results. For example, 29 different research groups were given the same data and asked to determine if dark-skinned soccer players are more likely to be given red cards. Using identical data, some groups found there was no significant effect, while others concluded dark-skinned players were 3 times as likely to receive a red card. The point is that data doesn't speak for itself. It must be interpreted. Looking at those results, it seems that dark-skinned players are more likely to get red-carded, but certainly not 3 times as likely. Consensus helps in this case, but for most results, only one research group provides the analysis, and therein lies the problem of incentives. Scientists have huge incentives to publish papers. In fact, their careers depend on it. As one scientist, Brian Nosek, puts it, there is no cost to getting things wrong. The cost is not getting them published. Journals are far more likely to publish results that reach statistical significance. So if a method of data analysis results in a p-value less than 0.05, then you're likely to go with that method. Publication's also more likely if the result is novel and unexpected. This encourages researchers to investigate more and more unlikely hypotheses, which further decreases the ratio of true to spurious relationships that are tested. Now, what about replication? Isn't science meant to self-correct by having other scientists replicate the findings of an initial discovery? In theory, yes, but in practice, it's more complicated. Like, take the precognition study from the start of this video. 3 researchers attempted to replicate one of those experiments, and what did they find? Well, surprise, surprise, the hit rate they obtained was not significantly different from chance. When they tried to publish their findings in the same journal as the original paper, they were rejected. The reason? The journal refuses to publish replication studies. So if you're a scientist, the successful strategy is clear. Don't even attempt replication studies because few journals will publish them. And there is a very good chance that your results won't be statistically significant anyway, in which case, instead of being able to convince colleagues of the lack of reproducibility of an effect, you will be accused of just not doing it right. So a far better approach is to test novel and unexpected hypotheses and then p-hack your way to a statistically significant result. Now, I don't want to be too cynical about this because over the past 10 years, things have started changing for the better. Many scientists acknowledge the problems I've outlined and are starting to take steps to correct them. There are more large-scale replication studies undertaken in the last 10 years. Plus, there's a site, Retraction Watch, dedicated to publicizing papers that have been withdrawn. There are online repositories for unpublished negative results, and there is a move towards submitting hypotheses and methods for peer review before conducting experiments, with the guarantee that research will be published regardless of results, so long as the procedure is followed. This eliminates publication bias, promotes higher-powered studies, and lessens the incentive for p-hacking. The thing I find most striking about the reproducibility crisis in science is not the prevalence of incorrect information in published scientific journals. After all, getting to the truth we know is hard, and mathematically not everything that is published can be correct. What gets me is the thought that even trying our best to figure out what's true, using our most sophisticated and rigorous mathematical tools, peer review, and standards of practice, we still get it wrong so often. So how frequently do we delude ourselves when we're not using the scientific method? As flawed as our science may be, it is far and away more reliable than any other way of knowing that we have.
Okay, so let me just go back to sharing. Okay, so yeah, hope you enjoyed that video. I certainly did. And by now you must be wondering, well, wow, all this sounds really tough. Can we avoid making decisions given that even expert scientists seem to be regularly either confusing themselves or misleading themselves and other people into believing things which are not true, right? So can we just leave the problem to the experts? And I think, that's a seemingly attractive option, but the problem is most policy and decision making is typically multidimensional. And you've got competing theories of behavior, and you've got a lot of trade-offs that you have to make here. Early on in the pandemic, and I think certainly any time any government, like Singapore's government, made a decision that people didn't like or didn't agree with, there was a lot of call that decisions should be made by the experts. But I'm going to tell you that if you had gone to public health experts or doctors or epidemiologists or whoever, they would have told you, sure, they can tell you something about whether the evidence in a particular area of COVID-19 is reliable or not, but they wouldn't be the best people to actually make decisions on what the government should do in terms of trying to alter people's behavior. Why? Because there's much more at stake here than just a theory about how COVID-19 spreads, than just a theory about whether vaccines, for example, are effective or not, or whether masks work or not, right? The other things that you have to think about as a government are the trade-offs. You have to think about whether, for example, one vaccine, which is logistically easier to distribute, might be more worthwhile distributing, even if it's less effective than a different vaccine, which is a higher efficacy rate, but at the same time, it's a lot more costly and much more difficult to get into the population, right? So that's a trade-off you have to make that a public health expert wouldn't be equipped to make because they wouldn't be able to make a decision over the logistics and cost. That's a different domain, right? Or if you have to make a decision over, for example, whether you should shut down the economy in order to preserve lives, sure, public health experts could give you some indication of the number of lives you might be likely to save if you were to reduce economic activity. But again, they wouldn't be in the best position to tell you whether it's a government or it's a society, is it actually worth, for example, putting a certain number of people into poverty or, putting a certain number of businesses into bankruptcy in order to save a certain number of lives, right? they are not the right people to actually make that kind of decision between the trade-offs. So for better or worse, we often rely on our elected politicians to make these decisions. And as I explained earlier, they can't leave the decision solely to the experts. So sometimes the call to leave decisions like this to the experts is just really a way of saying we don't like the decisions being made and we think that some mythical expert can make a better non-political decision, but all the decisions are inherently somewhat political, right? And the other problem is, even if there were experts out there who could who could actually tell you something useful in every single domain you have to decide on, quite often there's actually going to be a lack of credible evidence anyway that applies completely and perfectly to the context that you're worrying about. Because from a certain point of view, the only way to know the effect of a policy decision is to actually conduct a controlled experiment based on that policy decision, right? Because every situation is going to be somewhat different. So we couldn't, for example, infer perfectly that just because masks work in a country like Japan or China, that the mask policy of the same type would work the same way exactly in Singapore. We can't make the decision because the climate is different between Japan, China, and Singapore. The nature of the people is different, the culture is different, right? So, some people might argue, or maybe the Japanese, for example, already have a culture of mask wearing in public, so they're more used to doing that. They're less likely to fail to comply. They, already know how to wear masks properly so as to not contaminate themselves or other people. So there are all these other arguments that come into place that mean that it becomes difficult to argue that the evidence is perfectly applicable to the context that you're worrying about, right? So you have to make educated guesses about the counterfactual, but what would happen if you didn't embark on the policy and if you find that the difference between the counterfactual and the policy is probably big enough based on your best guesses, then you go ahead with the policy. So that's a challenge you have to worry about, okay? So I'm going to try to understand how we can apply some of these principles to a case study. And the case study is, well, when should we wear face masks to protect against COVID? And it's going to be a bit of a retrospective case study because we're going to look at some decisions that we in Singapore made over the last couple of years about face masks and COVID. And we're going to try to understand from the viewpoint of decision makers, what was the evidence available at the time? How did that evidence support a decision that was made? And actually, what's the difference between the evidence available and, you might say, the ideal evidence? So it's a way of trying to understand why were these decisions made. Okay, so I think Jasmine can put up the link to the articles I've got on the chat so everybody can see them. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go over briefly a summary of some of these articles, but I do want everybody to read them after I stop the summary. And then I think we're going to go into the breakout rooms after that, after I go through the summary and the questions, and then we'll have a chance to think about that, okay? All right, so let's take a look at, I'm just going to summarize some of the articles now. So I've given you 3 articles to think about. The first article is from February 2020 in the Straits Times. And if you remember what happened about 2+ years ago, this was the first couple of weeks of pandemic. We had just known at that point in time that there was a developing pandemic in China. I believe around that point of time, there weren't a lot of infected people in Singapore yet at the moment, but there was a lot of concern about what should be done, right? The public was wondering, well, what should we do? And one of the questions people had was, should we wear a mask or not, right? And this first article shows you, in case people have forgotten, that the firm recommendation of the authorities back then, and you can see from the article, based on scientific evidence, is that it is not necessary for everybody to wear a mask to avoid infection. That's very clear, right? So, and in fact, this evidence, I mean, this recommendation is backed by scientific evidence, right? It's backed by the argument, as you can see here, that social distancing is actually a perfectly sound strategy. And there's little evidence to show that wearing surgical N95 masks in the community when somebody is well will protect that person, okay? And much less homemade masks. They may instill a false sense of confidence and deplete mask supplies unnecessarily. So that was the evidence. I mean, that was the recommendation in February 2020, right? Okay, so what happened after that? Well, by the time we came around to June or even before that in Singapore, the evidence, or rather the official policy recommendations had changed completely. The World Health Organization, which back in around February or January 2020 also would have issued similar recommendations to Singapore's government, had by then change its advice on face masks, right? Saying that they should be worn in public where social distancing is impossible to help stop the spread of coronavirus, right? The global body said new information showed that face masks could provide a barrier for potentially infectious droplets. And of course, this is on the back of a number of countries, including Singapore by that point, already mandating face masks. But it's a useful reminder that a lot of the experts never recommended masks at the start of the pandemic, and the experts changed their mind on whether masks should be worn or not, okay? And even as late as a year after, and certainly even today, there still continue to be debates about whether mask mandates are a good or bad idea, especially in countries like the United States, for example, where there's where there's strong sentiment among many parts of the population against masks and government imposed restrictions, and where a lot of people have never really liked the idea of masks in the first place, right? And you can see from this article that even though over time more and more evidence is being accumulated on the potential benefits, or rather the actual benefits of wearing masks, even as more evidence is being accumulated, that doesn't necessarily lead to more and more policy decisions to keep on upholding wearing of masks, even as COVID-19 is, still spreading quite rapidly. Okay, so those are the articles that we can take a look at. Okay, so I think the questions I want us to think a bit about are, how can we make sense of the evidence? What evidence would have been ideal for making policy decisions on whether there should be a mask mandate or not very early on in the pandemic? And actually, crucially, what's the difference between the evidence that was out there and what the policymakers really would have wanted? Okay, going forward, and this is a bit more of a speculative question, well, what evidence do we need today if we're going to be making the next stage of decisions for what to do, And even today, there's a lot of differences of opinion on what we should do about COVID-19. Singapore and, much of the world has moved to open up. And you can still see that China and some other places are still very hesitant about opening up. Okay, so those are the questions we can keep in mind if we look at these three articles. And now I think we will put people into breakout groups. Let's take maybe about 10 minutes to discuss this among ourselves in our groups, and then we'll come back and have a bit of a discussion about these issues. Okay? Yeah.
So Walter, I will have 3 breakout groups, okay?
Oh, that's fine, yes.
Okay, I'm opening all the rooms now.
Once again, the breakout rooms are open. So if you see a prompt, go ahead and click join so that you can enter the breakout rooms for those of you who are still in the main room. I think there's still a couple of you left in the main room. So if you have any difficulties joining the breakout room, please let us know as well. We'll assist you in that.
I think I'll join room 2, Walter, because I think I think that's David. I think David is there. So I'll pop into room 2. There's somebody in room 2. Okay, he's out. Or do you want to do the discussion in the main room, Walter? Because I noted that there's some people who didn't join. Yeah, I think we
Yes,
should think
yes.
so. Yes.
I think, yeah, I think it's going maybe a bit difficult because perhaps some people are away from their PCs or whatever it is. So maybe let's just have the discussion as a group lah. Yeah.
Yes, I think
Yeah,
let's do that. I'll close the room now, yeah? Hang on.
yeah.
Just give me a minute for the room to auto close, Walter.
It's closing in about 50 seconds or so.
Yeah. Actually, your point, Walter, is very interesting. You know, when you start to use p value, right? The other thing is also the robustness of the studies. You know.
It is. And I think, yeah, that's a great question actually, Freeliang, because I think I guess it points to one of the things that I hope comes across, which is that we can't really rely on just one study in isolation, right? Because any one study has actually, frankly speaking, quite a high risk of being, a false positive, for example, right? Or being maybe conducted in a way which is not quite the most robust. But I think one of the things we have learned from the pandemic is as more and more evidence is accumulated on something, in a sense, that should inform our theory about what's going on in a way that leads us to conclude that the finding is actually much more robust. And I think certainly when it comes to things like vaccines or face masks, I would say that now the evidence should be fairly robust. Of course, one can, what I mean by that is you might quibble, for example, over whether the efficacy of a vaccine which is already known to be quite effective, right? Is it, I don't know, is it 95%, 96% or whatever in which population? So those things I think would never be determined very conclusively. But that they work in the sense that they're better than random chance is I think not controversial. It's not in serious dispute anymore. So there are certain things you do know, but there are also things that you have some uncertainty over. But okay, now that I think everybody is probably back from the breakout rooms, okay, would anybody like to, offer any comments on any of these points, right? So yeah, what's the difference between what we were working with early on in the pandemic and what we actually wanted to know? That's kind of the thing I want to talk about, right? Or think about.
I could just quickly chime in and point out that I think there is a distinction between the efficacy of masks versus the efficacy of a mask mandate. The mandate is a policy decision, of course, effected by any given government of the specific location that the mandate has been issued. But the mask evidence, I think, which is whether they do help to reduce the spread of COVID or not, I think that is stronger. The strongest evidence, in fact, we have is in randomized controlled trials in South Asia, where this was shown to be really efficacious. But then one has to kind of draw the slight distinction in the nuance between a mandate versus the masking per se, just because, of course, the mandate as a policy variable may be something that systematically differs between different jurisdictions, and these different jurisdictions may in turn differ in very unobservable ways that could influence whether the mask has an effect or not.
Yeah, I agree completely, James. I think that's a really good point, actually, because I think that refers to the issue that policymaking is unfortunately multidimensional, and we might have good evidence, as you point out, on the particular aspect of the policy, right? So we might somehow have good evidence that wearing masks in a certain setting, maybe it's a clinical setting or maybe it's a country-specific setting, sure, it works well in that setting. But unfortunately, we don't have the evidence to tell us that that same mask-wearing behavior or policy and mandate could be successfully applied in our setting, right? We don't have it by definition because if we had, because we haven't implemented the policy yet, so we would not be able to, know what the exact efficacy actually is. So that's actually so that's actually one of the challenges indeed, yeah. And I think, maybe a bit more broadly speaking, I guess certainly as a policymaker in Singapore, what I would have wanted early on in the pandemic is actually just plain evidence that mask wearing does something in a community setting. Because my reading of what policymakers were working on very early on in 2020 was that there was virtually no evidence of mask wearing in community settings. There was plenty of evidence of it, of course, in hospital settings, in settings with hazardous objects. There was plenty of laboratory evidence, but what policymakers were worrying about is we're going to have to decide, do we tell people or tell people not to wear masks in the public where, everybody would tell them, I mean, all the experts certainly were telling them, well, look, we already take, for example, maybe half a day or 1 day or something to train a medical professional to wear an N95 mask properly. So you're telling me that you're going to be expecting the public to wear all these masks perfectly, just by broadcasting something on TV and so on. So I'm sure they heard many stories of this type. So when you combine the lack of evidence of efficacy in a community setting with all of the other policy implications and difficulties with that, and also with this argument that was articulated in the article that people might be lulled into a false sense of security by wearing masks. And, of course, the other competing theory was that COVID-19 was spread primarily by fomites rather than by aerosol transmission. So, all these things put together, it's easy to understand why they made the decision they did, right? You might not agree with it, of course, ex post, or maybe you don't even agree with it back then. Certainly, there were many medical professionals who never agreed with it to begin with, but it is not an indefensible policy, given the evidence that was available and the theory behind the evidence that was constructed. I mean, that's at least how I take a look at it. Any other views on this? Yeah, right now? I mean, disclaimer, of course, I'm not a medical expert by any means, but, neither are a lot of the decision makers. So anyway, yeah. All right. Any other comments by participants on any of these topics? What evidence would have been ideal? Going forward, what evidence do we need today to make the next stage of decisions?
Walter, if I may chime in, I found a second item you've listed there is interesting. Evidence that did exist and what policymakers wanted. I was thinking perhaps there was a shortage of clinical masks in the medical settings. So perhaps there was concern that if everybody in the public started to use those medical masks, there will be a shortage of it. So perhaps what the policymakers wanted was also to protect, right, the safety of the hospital settings. So perhaps, that led them to say that, wear masks only if you need to and not otherwise.
Yeah, so that's certainly, I think, the logic behind that thinking. But I guess if you take a step backwards, in a sense, what you really would like to know, facing that kind of decision problem, right, is what's the relative cost benefit of exposing your general population versus exposing your medical professionals, right? And of course, there's a presumption here that what you have to do is you have to prioritize your medical professionals, because obviously without them, you're not going to be able to get any, effective medical treatment done. So that's certainly a concern. But I think what is interesting is how policymakers decided to cut off or to not seriously consider the alternative of not using professional masks. That's very clear in the article, right? So I think if you look at the article here, right, it's very clear that there was a decision by policymakers not to actually explicitly recommend homemade masks or scarves, right? Based partially on the clinical evidence, of course, because there's no clinical evidence, right? So again, thinking about how is evidence reduced, why on earth would researchers before COVID-19 have decided to conduct an experiment about wearing homemade masks or scarves might protect you from respiratory viruses? It's pretty obvious why they wouldn't have, because the idea is ludicrous, right? If you told, IRB or your funders, I want to conduct this study, they would say, yeah, why are you conducting that study? It's like, conducting a study into which, like voodoo medicine or something, right? It's not something that any first world medical professional would ever recommend. But of course, we ended up recommending it in Singapore and many other places because we had no choice. Because until high quality mask supply was assured, homemade masks were better than nothing, but there was not much of an evidence body on it because it wouldn't have occurred to developed country researchers to do that kind of study before COVID-19. So, yeah, so I guess, the issue is, when you run into a problem with COVID-19 and, like the discussion is showing, you have to suddenly contemplate a lot of policy options for which the research evidence just doesn't exist for one reason or another. And you have to do your best based on the evidence that does exist to try to construct a theory, right, of cause and effect that makes sense for the decision you want to make. Yeah. Okay. Anything or any questions that the audience has though? Because we certainly heard a lot from our my esteemed colleagues, but does any member of the audience want to venture any views on this? Yeah. If not, no worries, we can move on. I've got a couple of more things I want to share before I leave off. Okay, yeah. Okay, so I think, yeah, I've already discussed a bit of this in the early discussion. Thanks, James and Tui Leung, for having those engaging questions, right? I mean, you know, I think, yeah, the common message here, I think, basically is that it's really difficult to predict human behavior. We do the best we can, but there's not going to be the high quality gold standard evidence we would like for a lot of the public policy decisions we're trying to make, okay? But now I want to shift gears a bit in the last couple of minutes, just talk about decision making from an individual perspective rather than from a political or group or public policy perspective. How do we make evidence-based decisions for ourselves? And this is, quite honestly, just as, if not more challenging than making these big national policy decisions. Okay, why? I mean, at least if you're making big national policy decisions, you can rely on collective responsibility. Guess what? There's a thing called cabinet, right? You can go and blame the entire cabinet for making a bad decision. That's fine. But if you go and make a bad decision for yourself, I guess you only have yourself to blame. So it's pretty challenging. And the question I want us to think a bit about, right? And maybe cast your time, your mental model back about a year plus ago. Why was it so difficult for most of us to decide whether and how to get vaccinated? Okay, why is it so difficult? And maybe today in retrospect it seems like an obvious decision, but I remember distinctly it was not an obvious or easy decision for myself and a lot of people I knew. Okay, and in fact, being an expert doesn't help. I can tell you that most of my real doctor friends, okay, so I'm a fake doctor because I can't rescue you from a heart attack if you have one, but a lot of my real doctor friends really struggled with this decision. By no means were actual medical doctors the first ones to volunteer to get vaccinated. A lot of them also had a lot of concerns, doubts, wanted to know more about vaccination, had a lot of misgivings. A lot of people had. I mean, we have to be honest, this is really, how a lot of people were thinking in the early days of vaccination, okay? So why was it so difficult to make a decision on vaccination? Okay, so, and here I'm going to talk a bit about some aspects of individual psychology and decision-making research that sheds light on why this is so difficult. The fact is, a lot of decisions we make take place under uncertainty and ambiguity, right? We don't know for sure what's going to happen when we make a decision. When we get a vaccination, we don't know for sure whether it's effective or not. This was back then, before there was a huge amount of evidence on it. And we also don't know whether we're going to be one of the, you might say, unlucky people who might suffer a side effect of some type. Okay, so lots of decisions take place under uncertainty and ambiguity. And in order to try to figure out what should we do, a lot of the time we rely on decision shortcuts. We sometimes call these heuristics, that's a technical term for it. But these are basically ways of trying to make sense of complex information, which otherwise we can't really fit into our brain very easily. The problem is these decision shortcuts or heuristics actually end up systematically and provably biasing our decision making. So one example is given by this picture over here, right? Here you have a guy sitting on the beach, reading a newspaper, talking about a shark attack. Very scary. And so he looks at the people in the water playing, I guess water volleyball or whatever, and he thinks, oh, these guys are idiots. They're going to get eaten by a shark for sure. But of course, shark attacks are actually extremely rare. Even in areas or beaches like places of parts of Australia where they do happen, you're very, very unlikely to be attacked or eaten by a shark, extremely unlikely. But the problem is shark attacks are scary. They're salient, right? They are alarming, easily recallable, emotive. And what the research shows is we've got a strong tendency when thinking about problems to overweight information which is salient like this. And conversely, what do we not think about? We underweight routine information and baseline data statistics. So if you think about the vaccination context, vaccine injuries are salient. they're super salient. When we hear about somebody who goes for a vaccination and something happens to them, right? You know, they suffer a heart attack, they're in a hospital, or even if they just have a really, really big case of fatigue. Well, it's easy for us to imagine how is our life going to be affected if we were one of those unlucky people. But in contrast, when somebody gets vaccinated and nothing happens, there are minimal side effects, it's a complete non-event. We do not get Facebook posts from people saying, yeah, I got vaccinated last week and, you know, there's no side effect whatsoever, right? I mean, people do not make a lot of those kinds of Facebook posts, but on the other hand, if somebody is hurt by the vaccine, well, all of a sudden it gets shared all over the place. So the problem is the vaccine injury risk dominates our decision-making way out of proportion with the actual statistical risk because it's salient. It's very emotive and alarming, okay? So that's one problem. Another set of problems has to do with quite an old but very well-known finding, and I'm going to explain this finding by giving you the original research that the finding is based on. So this research is about 40 years old, but you might be alarmed to see how salient the framing of the problem actually is for our problem today. Okay, so this is a famous question posed to, some research participants by Kahneman and Tversky. So imagine the US is preparing for an outbreak of an unusual Asian disease, which is expected to kill 600 people. And there are two alternative programs to combat the disease, okay? So program A, it will save 200 of the 600 people, okay? Program B will save all the 600 with 1/3 chance, but it might fail and there's a 2/3 chance nobody is saved, right? So that's one way of looking at the problem. Here's the other way of looking at the problem. It's the same problem, an unusual Asian disease which will kill 600 people. But now we face program C and D. If I adopt program C, 400 people are going to die. If I adopt program D, there's a 1/3 chance nobody dies, but there's a 2/3 chance that 600 people will die. Okay? So what is the problem here? The problem here is that if I present to people these sets of choices in isolation, so I give some people the AB choice and I give some people the CD choice. The first thing you will notice, of course, is that looking at all these choices together, they're actually identical. So program A is the same as program C and program B is the same as program D, okay? Because if you save 200 people, that's equivalent to 400 people dying. Pretty obvious, if you see everything together. But when you present these choices to people in isolation, they found that between A and B, people preferred A, and between C and D, people preferred D. That's the problem, okay? So this is one of the cornerstone findings for their general theory of decision-making under risk. Is a prospect theory, but it's often called loss aversion, right? So that's one way of summarizing the way that people think about these kinds of problems. Basically, the finding is people tend to seek safe choices when facing gains, and they seek risky choices when facing losses. Why? Because the idea is when you're facing a situation where you might gain something, and in this case, it's framed as saving people's lives, you don't want to be responsible for the risk that in the end, nobody gets saved. You rather take a sure thing, save at least a couple of lives. But if I tell you that the decision is about avoiding people dying, which is a terrible thing, then all of a sudden, you don't want to be responsible for a decision that surely kills people. You'd rather roll the dice on a decision that might just save everybody instead, that might avoid all of the death instead. So you systematically change your attitude towards the risk, whether you want the safe choice or the risky choice, depending on whether I tell you this is a case of getting something good versus this is a case of avoiding something terrible. That's the problem, okay? So if you think about this in vaccination, the relevance is that when we offered people the chance to get vaccinated in Singapore and in many other countries, this choice was offered to many people who had never been exposed to COVID-19 or had not seen too many people suffer the severe effects from COVID. Certainly in Singapore, this is true because our control of COVID was so good that at the point that vaccination was offered, COVID was still a relatively, or rather an extremely rare event in Singapore at that point in time. So we were essentially asking lots of people to take a small risk, which is that something bad might happen from a vaccine injury, so a very small risk, in order to get a gain. The gain is you've got an even lower chance of suffering COVID-19. So when people were thinking about the decision, it's no surprise that a lot of people were very hesitant. Now, in contrast, If you take somebody who already has COVID and they know that there's a chance of death from it, they're suddenly going to become really willing to take all sorts of risks in order to avoid the chance of death. So I'm going to bet that a lot of times, the same person who says vaccination is very risky, it's unproven and so on, well, the moment they get COVID, they're going to agree to all sorts of experimental treatments just to avoid the chance of death, right? Because for them, the framing of the problem has changed completely. Of course, they're also sick, which is another issue, but framing actually does have a large effect on how we think about these problems. Okay, so that's actually more or less all I wanted to share today, just some quick concluding remarks. We're going to be seeing a lot of news on scientific evidence and data all the time, but we have to keep in mind when we read the news, okay, what's the cause and effect that I'm interested in or want to change? And you don't have to be a policymaker to have a view on this. You might have an opinion about current policy that the government has, even if you're not a direct policymaker, and surely you'd want to keep yourself informed as to whether it's a good or bad kind of policy. So keep in mind, what's the cause and effect relationship that I'm interested in? How should I use this evidence to inform our theory of behavior, bearing in mind that the evidence is unlikely to be ideal? It's likely to be suspect in one way or another, okay? You know, a lot of evidence is. And so we really want to look at the evidence critically and try to figure out, okay, am I going to change my view only because of this one piece of evidence? Or is this piece of evidence building into a broader theory of behavior where I've seen enough evidence, seen enough reputable studies that I think I can change my mind on this, or I think that it forms a wise basis for having a certain point of view? Okay, so that's the first thing. I also want to, remind everybody that we cannot make perfect decisions, given that there's always going to be uncertainty and limited information. But at the least, we can be aware of some decision biases that we might be exposed to and do our best to make sense of the evidence nonetheless. And I think this is just really kind of a teaser, but there are lots of courses in applied economics, public policy analysis, and behavioral decision-making, which are out there if people want to learn more about this. Okay. And I hope that has been a bit educational, and that's all I wanted to share today. If we have a bit of time, I'm very happy to take any questions or comments. If not, I'll follow the lead of the organizers in what we should do next then. So thank you for having me here today and having me share this with you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Theseira. I think that was a really